Hello, this is DeMisty Bellinger. I'm here with AWP. I serve on AWP's board. I teach at Fitchburg State University, and I am also a writer. I am here with writers and teachers Tara Campbell and Julie Iromuanya. Quickly, I'm going to give an introduction, and then we're going to talk about genre writing in the creative writing classroom, particularly genre writing with writers of color. And I'll start with an introduction to Tara Campbell and then Julie Iromuanya. And after that, I'll ask them some questions and we'll just have a conversation about teaching and writing. Tara Campbell is a writer, teacher, Campbell Fellow, and fiction co editor at Barrow House. She received her MFA from American University. Her previous publication credits include Smoke Along Quarterly, Master's Review, Wig Leaf, Jellyfish Review, Booth, Strange Horizons, and Craft Literary. She's the author of her novel Tree Evolution and four collections Circe's Bicycle, Midnight at the Organporium, Political AF, a Rage collection, and Cabinet of Wrath, a doll collection. You can connect with her at www.taracampbell.com or on Twitter at taracampbell.com. Julie Iromuanya is the author of Mr. and Mrs. Doctor from Coffee House Press. She's a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Award, the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction, the Etisalat Prize for Literature, now 9 Mobile Prize for Literature, and the National Book Critics Circle John Linder Prize for Debut Fiction. Her scholarly critical work most recently appears in Meridian's Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, Callaloo, a journal of African American arts and letters, and Afropolitan literature as world literature from Bloomsbury Publishing. She was the inaugural Herbert W. Martin Fellow in Creative Writing at the University of Dayton, and she teaches at the University of Chicago. She has at work on a second novel, A Season of Light, and you can find more on her website at julieiromanya.com. Thank you for joining me, Tara and Julie. How are you doing today? I should ask. Okay. I'm going to ask you a first question, and that is, can you speak to the inclusion of genre fiction in the creative writing classroom? And I just want to preface that by saying when I was in my MFA program, and even when I was at my doctoral program at Nebraska, genre was kind of looked down upon, especially sci-fi and horror. But I think there is, well, can you speak to the inclusion of genre fiction in the creative writing program?
Well, I guess I can go first. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie. And DeMisty, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for this invitation. Um, so, yeah, I do think there's definitely more inclusion of it these days and more appreciation of it than in the past. And I guess I'll kind of work my way back from the problem, which I think was even when I was an undergraduate and when I was in my graduate programs, there was definitely this refrain that we couldn't study genre writing, we couldn't do genre writing in our classes, and I think a lot of that had to do with like a lot of fears and concerns about the genre writing, particularly with learning writers focusing mostly on plot, focusing mostly on genre conventions, things like that, and then kind of eschewing all the other things that are really important about character and setting and other kinds of craft elements. So there was constant like concern about the balancing of that. And then I think in a lot of writing, a lot of writers read a lot of long form genre writing, right? And then you're in a workshop where you're writing short stories. And so what often happens is that there's this really great idea. It's huge, but somehow they're trying to get it all into one, into a story, and instead of thinking about a chapter versus a short story, right? So I think those kinds of problems assert themselves very early on, and so I think part of moving towards appreciating and understanding the great values in genre writing is attending to those concerns, like not avoiding them or ignoring them, but thinking about ways, thinking solutions, thinking about solutions around those problems and working through them. So I'll stop for now.
Yes, I would echo the points about genre fiction being held apart from fiction in terms of craft elements and how much there is to learn. And I have seen a change. My MFA came rather late in my academic career. I just finished it in 2019. So I was very pleased to see, to experience an openness to genre fiction that I did not anticipate. And my professors would say, well, I don't read a lot of genre fiction. I can't proclaim to be an expert in it, but as long as it's well done and as long as we're, being attentive to elements of fiction, and working on those, character development and other things that were mentioned, then, let's do it. So I feel like both in the reading world, and in the publishing world and in academe, there is a new openness. And I think, fear has a little bit to do with that past being closed, and that, the experts were kind of afraid to work with a genre in which they did not feel that they were experts. But I think that is changing as well, because we're looking at craft elements regardless of the genre. So I'm pleased to see more openness now.
All right. So a couple of interesting points that I want to point out that you both said. Julie, you said, for instance, that it does not lend to long form. And I know a lot of the complaints that I hear about MFA programs, which I don't think I had a problem with at my MFA program, is that they are limited to the short story, or they encourage short story writing. And I teach at a school where we have mostly undergraduate students, and what happens there is, at first I tried to encourage students to only write short fiction, but I thought that I was limiting students in that. Um, as writers, um, I'm not saying that short fiction doesn't sell, and I love the short story. Is probably my favorite form, but to get out there, we need novels a lot of time. We just need a novel, I think, and maybe people can argue with me on that, but yeah, I think one of the problems is that a lot of what you want to do in genre is world building and creating situations that take longer than 20 or 30 pages. But although there are some great short stories, and I know, for instance, Tara, that you've written some great, I've taught some of your flash fiction that is pretty genreistic. And Julie also mentioned character and plot, and this dichotomy that people have between character, and this is what literary fiction, big L literature, focuses on, but genre focuses on plot. And that's something that academics can get away from. If you really think about it, one of the books that is often taught, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, has both, of course, and that's genre. And lastly, Tara, you said as long as it's well done, that's good enough. And I think I came to that understanding in my own teaching. But also, as academics, I do think that we're uncomfortable, like getting outside of our wheelhouse of of teaching and expertise. Okay. Is there
Oh,
anything?
D, I just wanted to, like, I think the issue of like, if it's done well, then it's great. But the thing is, often it isn't done well yet, right? Because that's the work of the workshop, is to actually make it get to that place. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I do think some of those fears that are kind of swirling around prevent that from happening. But I think that there's a lot more excitement. I think really it has to do with a lot more excitement about what's happening in the publishing industry, in the
Mhm.
marketplace. And some of that is what's driving the change in direction. A lot of programs are hiring people that specifically focus on genre writing, different genres, so that those quote unquote experts in other areas don't have to necessarily take on that task, and that those people who really, really are enmeshed in that genre can be able to talk about it in more, intricate ways. And I think a lot of literature courses too are also including a lot more uh,
Yes.
genre works in their literature classes, and that kind of intellectual and analytical deep thinking about these forms and these genres, I think, are really important, and including that alongside what's happening in the workshop or kind of as a marriage that I think is really necessary.
Yes. Yes. That's a great point. And you're thinking about a lot of the writers. I'm thinking about the Black community or the Black writers, and the Latino writers that are coming out lately are coming out with in genre fiction, and they're coming out um, pretty big. I think that we have some big names now that rival um, white authors as far as science fiction goes, and moving into horror. And we see that in literature and in films with the Jordan Peele. So yeah. So how do we? I mentioned white writers. How do we challenge that idea that genre writing is reserved for white writers or Eurocentric writing? What are some of your ideas on that?
Well, I could jump in here. I think part of the reason speculative fiction has gotten kind of a bad rap in the past was because it was formulaic, because it was focused on the technology or the wow factor and not as much on the human relationships. And I think what women and writers of color are bringing to the genre is the fact that there are other problems that supersede the technology, and we're bringing those real world experiences into the genre, right? We have faced certain obstacles that these white male writers have not faced, even to get to the technology. And so that's the element of the world and relationships that we're bringing into the genre. And so, one of the greatest tools that I use to sort of familiarize myself with the genre, coming back to it, right? Having gone to an undergraduate program that focused on the classics, on the canon, and thinking, okay, I can't keep doing spec fic because it's not serious, it's not real literature. So I kind of let that go by the wayside. And then when I came back to speculative fiction in the 2000s, I found that anthologies then as now were a great way to familiarize myself with what was going on in the genre. And in particular, the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy series. And I've got my visual aids here. This is, I think, one of my favorites of the series. Every year there is a guest editor, and N.K. Jemisin was the guest editor for the 2018 anthology. And this series is curated with an eye to including, people from various genders and ethnicities and worldviews. And so I found that that was a way to sort of break out of that sort of white male tech focused or high fantasy with dragons everywhere, and to challenge both new and established readers of sci-fi and fantasy and show us a different way of doing it. And so that's what made me even more excited about the genre. And what kind of, like the scales fell from my eyes when I would go back and read the classics then after having encountered what's going on now. And I could see, oh, okay, gender roles. Oh, okay, race is like a non-issue basically. So just by sort of seeing what's going on now, it just made me excited to sort of get the word out there and to focus more now on the broader world of sci-fi and fantasy.
I love everything that you said, Tara, and I think I want to kind of piggyback off of one of the sort of concerns is the idea of genre fiction not being serious enough. And I think that there's an interesting history within our own communities of that kind of concern. And I think so. The Black Imagination by it's like an anthology by Sandra Jackson and Julie Moody Freeman does a really great job, particularly in its introduction, of talking about that history. Because one of the issues is that, like, especially if you think about the U.S. and then if you think about this globally, the history, like the things that have happened are already pretty surreal, right? And the apocalypse has already sort of happened and is still happening in some places. So some of the resistance within our own communities has often been like, well, why do you need to go write about the post-apocalypse or whatever happening on another planet is happening here? You know, I think about um, the Handmaid's Tale, and I was watching the series on Hulu when it first came out, and in some ways feeling a little appalled because of the ways in which um, the female body and the reproductive abilities of the female body were being positioned in a different way. And I thought, oh, that's already happened. That happened to slave women, right? Women who were enslaved, their bodies were, you know, their reproductive capabilities were taken from them, and they had to go through this underground, you know, circuit to get away and things like so. So in some ways, one of the fears, you know, one of the concerns within our own communities is that the work that thing is already happening. So I think that one of the ways that we make this genre fiction our own, these various speculative genres, is to think about one, the idea of agency, right? Our own agency within this world and navigating it, our own ideas of our futures, our own ways of re-seeing and re-understanding, like reconceptualizing the past. Um, and then just like imagining the world, right? Reimagining the world in ways that we want to. I think those are some really vital things. And I think alongside those things, I always think it's important to think about those, as Tara was mentioning, some of the social problems, right? And not get too lost in the tech and things like that, and lose the sort of the humanity and the experience of the people who are navigating that world as well, and the kinds of social problems that exist within that.
Yeah. And it's a wonderful vehicle, genre fiction, speculative, and I think horror too. I'm a horror aficionado. Really can use that form as a vehicle to discuss those social problems. And we see it happen not just in work written by writers of color, but also by white writers. You go back to Twilight Zone, Rod Serling did it all the time. But yes, yes, I think you're right in that. And I also think there is like this discrepancy of like, why are we doing this? This already exists or it has existed. But there are um my mother grew up in the South, and she often talks about my great great granduncle, I think whose parents or grandparents were born into slavery. They had tons of ghost stories and treasure stories. So those stories were told around the campfires or at night. It's in our culture, but for some reason we don't want to necessarily bring that up. Does anyone else want to add something to that point?
Yeah, you know, I think we're talking about one of a couple of stages of sort of you know, getting more perspectives into the genre. And you know, at first it was all about diversifying science fiction and fantasy. And I think I'm getting from the point of not diversifying, but saying this is science fiction and fantasy, right? It's that age-old debate between, you know, do we need Black literature or do we need literature redefined? And so I find I am sort of going through those stages in my own how I propose courses. Right? It's no longer diversity in sci-fi and fantasy. It is science fiction and fantasy. And oh, by the way, my reading list highlights women and people of color because that is science fiction and fantasy today. So I think there are a couple of stages that we're walking through, and you know what works for one group who might be interested in highlighting voices of color and women, you know, might be pointing that out. But for folks who are kind of reticent about that and don't want to get involved in politics or what have you, there's still a way to present it in terms of just human struggles, right? Just being a person on Earth, and science fiction just defamiliarizes that, but in a way that lets us reflect on our own humanity. So, you know, there's more than one way to accomplish this goal, keeping in mind that our stories are human stories.
Yeah. Julie, did you want to add something else to that too?
Yeah, I think, you know, to add to that, our stories are human stories, and they also come from our own histories, our own mythologies. So I think Nadia Corfor does a lot of work around this and sort of thinking about the idea of African futurism the notion that we have our own cosmologies and our own ways of seeing the world, right? Our own ways of ordering the world. And based on that system, as opposed to like a Western system, what follows, right? And so the speculation is asking that what if, what follows from this particular cosmological point or worldview. And I think that idea of grounding it in its own tradition, in its own place, in its own worldview, its own experiences, I think is a really important thing that the work can do, and that makes it speak to its own community and its own issues and problems and questions.
I was just reading. I'm going to be teaching a book by a white author next semester, Grady Hendrix, and I was just reading some of the other work that he's done, like reviews, and he's written a review in 2016, and just to get an idea of like renaming these things or revisiting and reclaiming books and our tradition. And I have often thought of Beloved as a horror book, but the title of this review is Beloved, the best horror novel the horror genre has never claimed. It's a good point. When I first read the book, and I was one of those people who did it backwards. I saw the movie before I read the book, and I thought, this is creepy AF. And when I read the book, it's like, this is really creepy. And at the end of Beloved, I always thought, what would have happened? You know, if I'm going to say the monster or the ghost won. Although, and you can name the monster lots of different ways in that novel, but the whole book, if you're not a little skin crawly while reading that, I think you're making it too academic or something. There's a lot there. So it's like this revisionist or this reclaiming of older lit in that light, I think. Or yeah. Okay, I'm loving this. I don't want you guys to go away.
When you were speaking, Dee, I was just thinking about the fingerprints in the flower and the
Oh my
Beloved. I
gosh.
just had that image.
There is
Crazy.
so much in that book. Like every copy I have of that book, and I bought it a couple of times, I just write. It's like as much of my writing as it is Toni Morrison's. It's so much. Yeah.
I have not yet felt ready to tackle that, just because of everything I've heard about it. It's I need to be like emotionally prepared to tackle that work. But when you were talking about sort of reclaiming, older works, another one of my visual aids I love to bring up, Orlando. I mean,
Yes.
this is speculative fiction, right? And nobody would accuse Virginia Woolf of being a genre hack.
Right.
So this genre blending has been going on as long as there's been writing. And I think it's great that we are standing up and taking pride in it now, because lots of folks have seen the value in it, even when sort of the standard bearers have not. So it's great to see it making a reemergence.
Great point. Great. That's one of my favorite books too. Yeah, it's I just want to say about Orlando, it's so forward thinking. She could have written it last year. Um, just an amazing book. Okay, Tara, when and why did you decide to start writing speculative fiction? How did you come to that?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I referred to briefly, I was an avid reader of science fiction, predominantly from a young age. Like in junior high, I was the nerd reading, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Asimov and Bradbury and watching Star Trek and all those kind of things. And then, once I got to college, I just felt like I had to sort of grow up and be a serious reader for a change. And so that's when I, went into the canon more. But even within the canon, getting back to this previous point, Nathaniel Hawthorne. I mean, that's some eerie, spooky, like sort of aformous dread, or amorphous dread kind of storytelling. And so there have always been genre elements, even in the canon. But I kind of felt this pressure to turn away from the more upfront sci-fi and fantasy. And then I just, when I started writing again, I wrote stories back then and have shredded most of that evidence of my of my poor skill set. But when I started getting back into writing in about 2010, had lain dormant. And that was the first thing I turned to when I started being creative again. And so this time I embraced it. And yeah, I had learned how to break away from the sci-fi canon, again, the white male technology focused canon. And I think that's when I was really able to embrace it and sort of really write into it and, put myself into the stories that I was writing.
Thank you. Julie, I have a question for you. I know you taught a class where you've encouraged students to reach into their own ethnic mythology. Can you tell us a little bit about the experience mostly so I can steal it for my own classes?
Yeah, of course. So the class is Africana speculative fiction, and I kind of define speculative fiction broadly as encompassing science fiction, futurism, horror, just about any fantasy, all those things underneath that genre, underneath that label. And what I did, because the class is focusing on Africana writing, but not all the students are, right? Which presents a problem, right? And the class is it was kind of an like a general education course, so it included mostly freshmen and sophomore, but there were students that are upperclassmen as well. And what I did is I treated Africana speculative writing as a case study. So we're reading all of these things and we're looking at them as a model, and then exploring other types of works, so other types of traditions, by using that case study as an example. So we looked at, and I tried to not just include literature, or rather to think about literature more expansively than the written text. So film and music, and there's some really, really great stuff that people are doing. And I'm like, okay, let's listen to Erica Badu and let's talk about this. And they're like, oh, okay. What about Janelle Monáe? And then, so that's kind of an entryway for them to sort of think about how they're seeing the world in these very spectacular ways. The other thing is, so I encourage the students to kind of, my approach was like, okay, we're going to look at this in terms of the local and the personal and the familial. So the local in the sense that, like, we're going to look at our own backyard and use that as a backdrop or as a setting, and then begin from there. So some of the assignment prompts that I had were based in the south side of Chicago. Hyde Park is a neighborhood. So I said, okay, well, this is essentially a thought experiment, and the whole class was really, I thought of it as a kind of lab, and I would present them with questions and different kinds of prompts and give them field work to do. And the field work was essentially going to different kinds of places to do research, and then incorporating those things into their project. So for example, one of the assignments we did was we went to the DuSable Museum, it's an African American history museum here in the south side of Chicago. And I asked them to look for some kind of textual artifact in that space. And so they had to comb through and go through and look at all the exhibits, and collect something. And they collected all kinds of really interesting things, like letters, images, different kinds of talismans, different kinds of things in that space. And we did another field. So that was one type of history. And then I asked them to do an innovative kind of exploration. So I asked them to do some research on some kind of innovation at some point in history, and to scour the archives, old like magazines, commercials and ads. So like we're looking on YouTube at old commercials. We're looking in the library. So we had a really great partnership with the librarians, because they helped us to find all these different sources. And so now you're going to write something that combines something from the past and something from the future. And this is kind of the point where I kind of step back, because now I'm like, these are your ingredients, and you're going to go into the lab and you're going to mix them together in some way. And some students really hated that, because they like wanted me to tell them the next thing to do, right? Okay, so what should I do with this artifact, or what should I do with this innovation? How do I put them together? But that's the point where I kind of step back and say, now go ahead and mix it together in some way, right? And so that's kind of, so I had little assignments like that. I also encourage students to look into their own familial histories, right? The kinds of stories that have been told over and over in their families. Some of those may be cultural or ethnic kind of stories that have been told and repeated over time. And that sometimes is a great source material. The deeper stories that go back, and then the more recent stories that families share among each other, and then to sort of use those as places, as springboards for moving forward with the stories. And so there were some really, really interesting things that students wrote. I think some of my best student writing came out of the class, because they really, really expanded their minds And I think this is one of the joys of genre fiction, is that sometimes we do get really locked into writing about issues in the same way, right? So now if you want to write about race, you're going to write about it in a very different way, because race is a really very important, very present thing on the south side of Chicago, right? And economics and those issues. So you can't ignore them, but we're not going to talk about them in the same way that we normally would in a traditional story. And so that kind of disorientation and like that feeling of the world, the ground being shaky under your feet, I think is a really, really valuable thing. And then it kind of, it creates these breakthroughs. And sometimes the stories, you know, experiments sometimes fail, right? They don't always come across in the best way, but it's that thinking that I think is really, really valuable, of just looking at it with a very different set of eyes. And I think that's what the genre fiction, particularly like science fiction and futurism, is really exciting about. It's like, we're going to see the world in a new way. We're going to envision it, you know, we're going to think about this as an experiment and follow the path that it takes.
I love that you mentioned that sometimes these things fail, because a classroom should be, ideally, a creative writing classroom should be a place where you can have those moments of failure. You know, we should be able to discover what works and what doesn't in those spaces. What a brilliant class! I wish I could take a class like that. That sounds lovely. Oh my gosh, that sounds really wow. Um, so Julie, and this is to both of you, because I know all of your students were not Black or African American. So, but they were going into DeSable, for instance, and looking at artifacts that are from Black history or Black art. How do you balance culture and exchange without appropriating other cultures in writing? And this is a question for both of you. So, how does that work?
Well, I can start because you know, it is something that comes up not only in terms of, you know, sources we're reading, but also in terms of writing. And I think students are attuned to, you know, there being more viewpoints out there, and you know, and writers at all stages in their careers are grappling with this. How do I incorporate the whole world without, you know, sort of engaging in tokenism um, or appropriation. And my guiding principle has been to look at your reason for doing it. What is your motivation in bringing in a character from a certain background? And I speak from experience because I dealt with this myself when I was writing my novel, Treevolution. Um, so this is a novel about trees, nature, natural resources. And growing up in Alaska, any discussion about natural resources included the voice of our Native communities. And I'm not saying it was always harmonious and lovely and agreeable, but it always included that voice. And so if I was going to write a novel about natural resources, I couldn't see myself erasing this voice from that debate. And my solution was to create a character that could be an individual, like a three-dimensional individual with his own faults and his own strengths, and not attempt to create a character that encapsulates the whole community. I wound up writing a whole community so I could sort of demonstrate the breadth of personalities and motivations and drivers, you know, that exist in any community. But I really had to look at, why am I trying to do this? And is it more responsible for me to step away from it or to include it? Like, where's the greater opportunity for harm? And I decided that given this specific subject matter, there is greater opportunity for harm by excluding that voice. But I found if I gave myself an opportunity to humanize that perspective and make it an individual, and just have any sort of negative qualities reflect on the individual rather than the whole society, then I would come closest to the reason that I was having that voice in there. And so, you know, it all gets back to motivation and how much latitude are you giving that character to be a real three-dimensional human being?
Yeah, Tara, that point that you made about erasure, I think is something I think about this a lot with teaching writing, and not just in my speculative writing class, but just in general, so there's this important conversation that's happening around appropriation that needs to be had, right? Because on one end, we have this sort of mindless kind of writing and tokenism and dipping back and forth without really thinking about it. But then on the other end of it, we have a kind of skittishness and fear to write about other people, which to me is another kind of erasure, right? As you were pointing out. And what I started to see more recently in student writing was that genre fiction was actually becoming their way to avoid the problem, right? So we're just going to write about aliens in outer space because we don't want to write about only white people, and we don't want to write about, at the same time, we can't write about other people because we don't want to appropriate them. So we'll just write about aliens on another planet. And I think that's that kind of way of thinking about genre fiction is deeply problematic because it avoids these things, this conversation that really does need to be happening, and that discourse needs to be happening within the writing. So in some ways, in the work that I, with the teaching that I do, I try to like force them to confront those issues in, those issues, like, for example, in orienting a project in the South Side of Chicago, forcing them to think about that, but then at the same time, think about that through the lens and through the tools that are given to us through genre, the different kinds of genres and the different kinds of conventions that exist within those genres. The other thing is, as far as appropriation and working around it, I think sometimes because we're thinking about this as a lab in the classroom, sometimes I do a lot of collaborative assignments. So students have to get together in groups and work on something together. So like, here's a problem that you have to solve, and, think about like the scientific method. Here's your hypothesis, and here's an experiment you're going to do, and these are the things you. So I think that sometimes that collaborative work is really good because that exchange and the conversation is really, really valuable. And collaborating on assignments, but then also collaborating on the peer review part, I think is a really important thing too. And trying to create a space, and I know this is like easier said than done, where experimentation is encouraged and failure is also encouraged too, right? But then at the same time, like, well, what do you do with that failure? Or, if you try something out and it doesn't quite work, so that really requires you to be very trusting of the people around you and to engage in serious conversations with a lot of depth about what's happening in your work. And so some of that doesn't happen right away, but like the idea is that hopefully you get to a place. And also, like, there's a kind of shared kinship, and the fact that everyone is disoriented in this weird landscape of speculative writing. And so they kind of have to lean on each other in certain ways. And so if someone's kind of doing something, it's like, I don't know if that really works. Or like, so if you have this kind of character in your story, then maybe, to the point of a character representing themselves as an individual rather than the community, maybe what you need to do is balance that by having different kinds of characters who have different kinds of ways of seeing that world and engaging and moving through that space, so that one doesn't then become the representative or the archetype for the whole entire community.
Okay. These answers are great. The whole idea of erasure, or not just making a character who is a caricature, but a person, like someone that you can actually interact with, who has their own ideas or movement. And there is that fear. I see it in my own classrooms too, where students are afraid to sometimes even write the other gender. And I'm not sure that's not world building and speculative or any fiction. That's the show Friends, where everybody kind of looks alike. Not to say anything bad about Friends, but that was the complaint in the 80s and the 90s, that there weren't more characters and that weren't mainstream. So it's an interesting problem, and it's one that I deal with a lot. I have two more questions, although I know I only gave you one more. But how can educators who are trained in literary programs that eschew genre develop skills to teach or write genre writing? Like, for instance, I was raised in programs where no one wrote genre. How do I acquire the skill set needed for teaching it?
If I can jump in because this comment relates to the previous topic. Reading, right? Reading is really starting point for writing and for understanding other viewpoints. And so, to sort of round out that last discussion, if you're not willing to put in the time to read books by those people you're trying to write about, then maybe you shouldn't be writing about them, So, and that's something that kind of made me feel more confident in my, crafting this native character. Is that I felt I had read, like, I didn't just go off of what I remembered, right? I took the time to read texts by Indigenous authors and figure out, rather than what concerns I want him to have, what concerns do those communities have? And so I kind of use that as my organizing principle in figuring out how to incorporate this character into my book. And so I would, say that that could be an aid and perhaps a comfort to folks who are trying to write different perspectives. But as that relates to the current question, again, reading to find out what's going on now in the genre and what you as an educator can get excited about in the genre. And again, this Best American Sci-Fi and Fantasy series is something that I have used to refamiliarize myself. And the benefit to anthologies like this one is they pull from pieces that were published from a wide array of publications, not just all genre publications, but also, the work I like to use as an example is Shape Ups at Delilah's, which is a story written by Rhian Amilcar Scott and was published in the New Yorker, which is not a genre rag, right? But it was anthologized in this, Best American Sci-Fi and Fantasy. So that's a place to get inputs from a variety of perspectives and publications that's gone through somewhat of a vetting process. And so you can sort of be assured that you're being current, that you're being an informed reader. And from there, you can go on to pursue other authors that excite you, which is how I found, another visual aid coming up here, which is how I found this amazing collection, How Long Till Black Future Month by N.K. Jemisin. After I read the anthology that she had curated, I picked this up. And this also is a great place to start for folks who are just kind of educating themselves, because it spans the breadth of speculative fiction. There's hard sci-fi, soft sci-fi, high fantasy, myth, horror, everything in there. So you get kind of a précis on, like, what is this genre anyway? And looking at getting out of these sort of white male underpinnings of it, but really expanding to sort of meet your students where they are now.
Thank you for sharing that resource. Yeah, I think that point about it, you have to, like, whatever you assign your students to read, you have to love it yourself. Or if you don't love it, you have to, like, that becomes part of the conversation, right? Because I do think, especially if you're not, because I definitely was not a sci-fi genre. I didn't read that stuff when I was growing up. But I mean, I feel like I read adjacent work in the sense that magical realism, reading about that. And so, and thinking about the world in different ways from that, and being unmoored in certain ways is useful. But I do think for me, one thing is to start as a teacher, to read a lot of stuff, right? To do a lot of research, but to read stuff and to teach stuff that you're really excited about, even if it's to, like, debate it, right? Because, like, I bring in George Schuyler is great for bringing up debates in class about some of the issues that he's tackling. It's a very conservative voice in a very liberal kind of space, and sort of jockeying around with some of the concerns he brings up in his satire is I think is a fun thing to watch, and not to participate in, but to watch. So I think that that's a really important thing to do, is kind of pick things that really excite you and work for them. The other thing that I started to do a lot of is actually, it's the thing that we're told not to do with, like, our literary fiction, because we try not to be formulaic, right? But I actually think it's really useful to, like, create a catalog of, like, literary terms within genre and different conventions. And so I started to, like, catalog different kinds of things, some of them that I found on my own from reading things, and then some things that I read about the craft of it from different writers. So, like, for example, we had I had an assignment. We're looking at Kindred by Octavia Butler, and so things like okay, we're going to talk about temporal paradoxes, the butterfly effect, the grandfather paradox, object loops, stable time loops, perception, the Hitler paradox, all these kinds of things. The inevitability, right? The question of predestination or reversals, the static time continuum, alternate and parallel universes, all these kinds of terms, like bringing those into the conversation and then spinning them towards thinking about them in relation to how they might address social problems, right? And how this problem is being addressed in that novel in Kindred. So what is it? Why are we going into the past, and what kinds of problems, what conflicts does this particular genre convention provide for us, and how then can it be a tool, to explore plot or structure in a useful way? So I think like creating those kinds of catalogs around the different kinds of futuristic writing, kind of creating a catalog for that, horror writing, a catalog of conventions of the genre or terms within that, and then kind of it's fun. I think a lot of students actually find it really fun to spot those things in the writing, and then to have a conversation around what it's actually doing for the work.
Great responses. Reading is the question that I always get from students, like, how do I become a better writer? Blah, 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 blah. How do I improve? What are the twos? The first answer is always to read. You just have to read voraciously. You do. And I love this idea of cataloging devices or conventions. And what a great idea. And what a great way of looking at Kindred. The Hitler paradox, when you laugh. But yeah, the whole butterfly effect, or traveling back in time, Back to the Future. The last question I have for you is, what didn't I ask? What do you want to talk about regarding genre of writing and teaching?
I'll go first. That it can and should be fun. I think one of the things that can seem a little daunting about getting into a new genre is when you're in these networks, and I have this issue myself happen to me, where everyone seems to know the material already, and they're just throwing around names of authors, and you feel like I don't belong here. But what I really enjoyed about Julie's last comment was that she's basing all these concepts in a very specific work we're looking at, and that it's okay to look at a specific work and not know everything yet, and feel like this can still be your space. You just may not know the whole landscape yet, but this can be your space. So it hopefully should be fun. And that question of what if, that really for me is where I feel the excitement. And that's why I was so excited about this N.K. Jemisin collection, because I felt her excitement exploring all these different genres and just asking the what if and exploring. So hopefully, anything I can do as a teacher to make it fun and less daunting and invite people into it. And it's not something to be sort of held up on a pedestal and revered and respected, but it's something to be enjoyed and understood and held in your hand. So anything I can do as a teacher to sort of inspire that kind of learning, I think makes it more fun for me, if nobody else, but also hopefully more relevant for the students.
And I think they, at least for me anyways, because this wasn't a genre that I grew up reading, but like they know a lot more about this stuff than we do. I mean, they're experts in it, like because some of them like that's their thing. I mean, for example, I didn't know anything about elves. Now I know all these things about the elf world, like the conventions of stories that feature elves, like, and they are good because they spot those things themselves in the work. They're like, oh, you're doing this, and this is that type of character, and so I think that one of the things that I've learned is that like I'm not an expert in it, and like acknowledging that and being okay with not being an expert in this, and then also like and this is something that I'm still trying to figure out ways to do, but just like finding ways to take to incorporate the knowledge of the students, like for example the elfing, right? Well, that could be a really interesting catalog to put together. Some of it is like, so some of it might be me putting things together, but some of it might be creating assignments to ask the students to like look at a piece of work and then to create their own catalog of some of the devices that are in there, so that there's a kind of collaborative exchange of work. Something that I always try to do is ask students to like add, like we have a running list of texts that I ask students just to add books or stories they think would be really valuable for others to read. Um, and specific to the class, the type of work we're doing in the class, because I couldn't possibly assign every single thing. And sometimes it's just like the most, I go through so much anguish trying to narrow the list down to just a few texts for, for, in our case, we are on quarters. So we really only have like 9 weeks, so yeah. So it's like, there's this anxiety about what to put in there, what I just left off. And so that having that list, that working list that they keep adding to is one of the ways to do that. Sometimes like I forget to, sometimes students will forget. So I kind of keep reminding them, throughout the semester, oh, if this comes up, make sure you put that on the list. Because that can be really a really great tool for me to go back to as a resource in the future. And then of course for other students. And they're really excited too when they find out, oh, you read that too. Oh, I read that when I love that book, and it's also kind of a great way of like creating that community, that sense of community in the classroom too.
That's a great idea. Instilling everything. Thank you both so much, Julie Iromuanya and Tara Campbell, for this lovely conversation. Very enlightening. So much information here. Thank you so much for coming and talking with me about genre and teaching genre fiction.
Thank you for the invitation. This has been a lot of fun for me too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a great conversation.
Thank you.